All right. Hi, everyone. This is the ATHX podcast. I wanted to make a podcast about Athersys to talk a little bit about what's going on with the company and some of the recent events that are occurring. My name's Nick. I've been an investor in the company since 2017. My social media can be seen on the bottom right of the screen here. Today's July 3rd, 2020, and I'm mostly going to be talking about BARDA. So before we get started, some disclosures. I'm not employed by Athersys. I'm not a financial advisor. This is not investment advice, and I do own shares of ATHX. So one of the most important things going on with the company right now is they're in discussions with BARDA. BARDA is a U.S. government agency focused on providing countermeasures and research and development against biological threats facing the United States. BARDA had approached Athersys in late January regarding the potential use of multistem in coronavirus patients who are hospitalized. So kind of how the timeline of events occurred. On March 16th, Athersys had publicly announced that BARDA classified their product multistem as highly relevant for use in COVID-19 patients. Investors were kind of in the dark until that March 16th point, but Athersys had actually been in discussion with BARDA since late January. Around that time, Athersys had submitted a full proposal to BARDA. This is usually something that's over 100 pages long. In mid-April, BARDA classified that full proposal as acceptable, and this had to go through a scientific review to be rated as acceptable. At this point, they went into the negotiation stages with BARDA, but on April 22nd, Rick Bright, who was the director of BARDA, was reassigned away from that director position, so he was no longer in charge of the funding decisions that BARDA was making. So he was put into a lesser role. A lot of people saw that as a political move. He filed a whistleblower complaint claiming politics got involved in the agency's decision making. On May 22nd, an SMBC NICO report came out stating that the main thing holding up BARDA funding to Athersys was the safety cohorts in the Macovia study. So there's two safety cohorts in that Macovia study. And the report claimed that it was likely that those two safety cohorts had to be completed before BARDA would want to move forward with that funding Athersys, just to make sure that the product was safe in COVID-19 patients. This is not something that I've seen they required from any other companies that they gave funding to, but it is what the SMBC NICO report stated. David Huang, the analyst, stated to look for late June for an update on this. Today's July 3rd. We still haven't heard anything. On June 3rd, BARDA came out with a broad agency announcement. This amendment suspending Area of Interest 9.3 for immunomodulatory therapeutics targeting lung repair. So this is what multistem would fall into. And so even though Athersys, up until this point, had kind of claimed that they're in negotiation stages or discussions with BARDA, BARDA came out with this statement saying, hey, we're not going to be looking into this area of interest anymore in terms of funding. But it's confusing. I mean, I'll show you exactly what the statement says right here. It says, suspend area of interest 9.3 immunomodulators or therapeutics targeting lung repair. This area of interest is suspended until further notice. All white papers or proposals submitted to this area of interest will be considered automatically non-responsive. So it's unclear when it says all white papers or full proposals submitted to this area of interest will be considered automatically non-responsive, if that is only for companies at the full proposal stage or before, or if it also relates to the companies in negotiation stage like Athersys. So it's not clear if it directly affects the funding for Athersys in this statement. However, an NYT, New York Times article came out on June 19th referencing this BAA, in the 9.3 amendment specifically, and it kind of implied to the investor community that BARDA was unlikely to fund Athersys anymore due to this amendment change. So this news tanked the stock price essentially. Something else of note in the New York Times article was a mention of a master protocol / clinical trial network to test multiple treatments. This was kind of mentioned as an alternative to funding individual treatments like individual immunomodulators. I think the exact quote here is, she said the agency was setting up a clinical trial network to test multiple treatments, a better approach than supporting expensive clinical trials for each product separately. However, BARDA has not yet announced any such clinical trials. And Ms. Kane said how such a clinical trial would be run is in early planning stages. So on June 20th, SMBC NICO came out with report number 2 stating that they talked with Athersys management directly, who explicitly stated that the multi-stem proposal will be unaffected by the 9.3 amendment. So the stock swung back up as a result in the sentiment change towards people's views on the BARDA funding going through. So we haven't really heard that much between that point and then July 2nd, but on July 2nd, a few things happened. There was a testimony from leaders of the CDC, leaders of the NIH, and the new leader of BARDA, whose name is Gary Disbrow. They all testified in front of Congress about vaccines and about the warp speed project that's going on. One of the questions that was asked by Congress to Gary Disbrow and the others were asking if they felt political pressure to make decisions regarding which companies to fund. And Gary Disbrow essentially stated, no, I'm not feeling any political pressure. I'm making decisions based on science, okay? Which is interesting because many people speculate that Trump may have replaced Rick Bright with someone who will just make the decisions, that are more favorable with what Trump wants, which there may be truth to that, maybe not, but according to Gary Disbrow, there is not truth to it. He also had an interesting comment regarding specifically that 9.3 amendment change, and he talked about kind of the move away from that 9.3 area of interest for BARDA and how it was moved over to the NIH and Operation Warp Speed into this thing called the ACTIVE program. Another thing that happened on July 2nd was that Athersys had updated its corporate presentation, and in the corporate presentation, BARDA was still in the company objectives. So this tells me that they have not yet received a negative response and that BARDA is probably still in play. Another thing that happened on July 2nd was these two politicians, Menendez and Pascarell, sent an open letter to the leadership at BARDA requesting information regarding the change in area of interest 9.3 and was wondering if there were any political reasoning behind this. The letter was kind of in an accusatorial tone, so that is interesting if anything will come of that. They're requesting information on that by July 20th. So I'm going to play some of the testimony that happened on July 2nd.
Mr. Chairman, I want to follow up on Senator Murray's question. We're in the middle of a national pandemic. We're also in the middle of a national presidential campaign. And I think her question goes to the fundamental, basic desire for testimony here on where we stand in terms of the political world before we address the medical world. I'd like to ask the three witnesses here if any of them have felt any pressure, political pressure, from the White House or other agencies in terms of the selection of the companies to develop a vaccine, the timing of the vaccine development, the announcement of a vaccine, or any other aspect that is part of your responsibility on the medical side?
No, sir, no political pressure. Lots of internal pressure as a physician and a member of the world to try to find the answers.
Dr. Redfield?
Senator, my answer is no.
Mr. Distro?
My answer is no as well. I'm a scientist, not a politician.
Thank you. That's what I was hoping for, and I think that's what the American people are looking for. And so let me go to the next question on the medical side.
Okay, the next clip I want to play is a video of Gary Disbrow discussing the change in area of interest 9.3 from BARDA's focus.
Warp speed, similar to what we're doing for vaccines. We did close the immunotherapeutics portion of our broad agency announcement because at the same time, under Operation Warp Speed in collaboration with Dr. Collins' ACTIVE program, what we were receiving were individual proposals with no clear identification that the products would work as an immune modulator, but requesting very large phase 2-3 studies. So under the ACTIVE partnership and with OWS, the decision was made to stand up large clinical trials, a clinical network under a master protocol where you can evaluate multiple candidates for immune modulators, and they will also be looking at anticoagulants as well, in a smaller cohort to determine if there's clinical benefit. If any of these drugs that are run through the active protocols show clinical benefit, we are happy to engage with those developers to help them with manufacturing.
So it was also reported that BARDA is suspending.
All right. So what he talked about there is this active program. That's what they're calling it. It's part of NIH. And it sounds like to me from that statement that the 9.3 amendment was pushed over to the NIH and is going to be put into this active program for doing a master protocol based on those comments. So I want to play one last video piece for you guys. It's talking about potentially more funding for BARDA in the future. So let's play it right now.
We are preparing to make sure we have redundancy in our cold chain capability.
Dr. Dispo, there may be more than one more COVID bill, but I think we should assume that between now and sometime very late this year, there's probably one more chance to get this right funding-wise. How much money do you need?
So I can't go on the record and say how much we need, but we will work with Congress and through our ASFR colleagues, our budget office at HHS, as additional needs are identified to bring them quickly to you.
Well, so you're going to work that up through the secretary?
Correct.
All right, we need to know that number, and we need to know that number pretty quick, and then we'll have a discussion about whether it's appropriate or not, but we need to be thinking about that. Dr. Redfield, do you want to talk about this topic?
So this video to me signifies that there's a good chance that more money is going to be going to BARDA as an agency in the future. So what could a BARDA deal / government partnership look like? If it was just a partnership with just BARDA, which is what a lot of people have been expecting, the base minimum that I would expect is probably a cost-sharing agreement for Macovia and with potential additional options added on top of this deal to make it potentially larger. So that can include manufacturing assistance. I've heard of BARDA funding manufacturing facilities for companies. That could also include a stockpile of the product if BARDA decided that they would like to use the product multi-stem for either coronavirus or problems in the future. That goes along with maybe potentially funding an general ARD study that is not specific to coronavirus, that is, pathogen independent. So that would make sense to me because BARDA's mission is not just coronavirus, it is for biological threats as a whole. ARDS plays a part in a lot of them. There was an SMBC NICO report that I think not a lot of people saw. It was hidden within the second SMBC NICO report. In the first or second paragraph, there's a link that you can click on. And within that report, it talks about the details of the BARDA process. And part of that is it talks about this scientific review board that has to review the full proposal that Athersys had submitted. They're referred to as the TEP. I thought it was interesting that some of the criteria that this TEP looks at, it's based on a 100-point scale that they rank this on. Some of the criteria for that 100-point scale include being a U.S. domiciled company, having phase 1 safety data, having evidence of manufacturing capability, a track record of successfully receiving FDA approval and bringing products to market, applicability to multiple indications, and ability to obtain partial funding from investors and or strategic partners. Contracts are prioritized starting with the highest ranked proposal. So Athersys fits a lot of that criteria either in the product or the characteristics of the company and their capabilities. So I think they would score pretty high on that list. The report goes on to talk about, after that scientific review, there's a budget review process. And then the final step is the BARDA director has to sign off on the project for it to be publicly disclosed and for the award to go through. So that is the final step. The BARDA director has to sign off. And I think that's where Athersys was. And I don't think the BARDA director had signed off. And I think that they had potentially decided to change this 9.3 immunomodulatory area of interest around this time, and they had maybe sent the responsibility of this therapeutics trial, Macovia, to the NIH instead. And that might be why there is a delay and we're not hearing anything. So if there were a partnership with the NIH, I think it would be under this active program, ACTIV program is what they're calling it. It's regarding essentially a master protocol for therapeutic products. And what that would do is that would eliminate the need for a placebo group in each individual therapeutic trial. It would be a pooled placebo group, essentially. So this would potentially expedite enrollment for each trial, and it would also maybe set up a clinical trial network, because that NIH would have maybe a trial network set up or help Athersys set up clinical trial sites. So it could expedite enrollment, and if there were positive results, I think that's when BARDA would come in and form an official partnership with Athersys. This is just a hypothesis, but I think it is more likely that this occurs than just getting BARDA funding straight up anymore. But we'll see. It would also be consistent with the New York Times article discussing this master protocol, and it would be also consistent with what Gary Disbrow said at the testimony regarding the unclear evidence for immunomodulatory agents that are requesting large phase 2-3 studies that are expensive, and that kind of sounds like Macovia to me. So I think the main point of the podcast today was to talk about what we know about BARDA, what we know about the relationship between BARDA and Athersys, and what is the most likely scenario going forward. In my view, it's the partnership with the NIH in involvement in this active program. And I'd just like to say that I think there's room for multi-stem to improve patient outcomes here. In addition to potentially steroids and monoclonal antibodies, Regeneron and Sanofi came out with their Kevzara IL-6 receptor antagonist data, phase 3 data, yesterday, I believe, and it showed that it did not improve patient outcomes. So I think it reiterates the need for innovative solutions such as multi-stem, and I think it's sort of irresponsible of the government to have waited this long already to provide funding to a therapeutic with a good chance at success and improving patient outcomes in the middle of a pandemic. So obviously, whatever happens with BARDA funding or the relationship with the NIH, however this actually plays out is going to have an effect on the stock price, I think, pretty significantly. So good luck to us all. Thank you guys for listening, and have a good rest of your day.